Hello again. Unfortunately, today's program was slightly delayed. We had it all set up. It was looking really good. But unfortunately, these people who were here, Mr. Obama and Mr. Carter, had to leave. I did take notes, though, on our conversation, and I hope that we can make some sense. This is all about the midterm election coming up next month, November, and we're going to do a three-part analysis of it, talking about who's in it and talking about the Republicans and Trump kind of superficially, and then go more into depth. So 1, 2, and 3. First question is, obviously, who's in it? And what it comes down to, I think, it's a big question, actually. Mr. Trump is in it. I can't remember an election like this, the one that's coming up, that's been so heavily flavored by who's in the White House. This one is really something. So Mr. Trump is in it. Now, of course, there are two parts, the Senate and the House. In the Senate, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the Republicans will still be taking charge in the Senate. No problem there for the Republicans. And then on the other hand, the House races seem to be a little more up in the air than the Democrats were hoping and the Republicans were fearing. About a month ago, something like that, people were talking about a blue wave, a tsunami of Democrats sweeping into the House and eliminating Trumpian politics to some extent. But now we're not so sure. Now, there's a really important question that some Republicans have raised. What happens investigation-wise if the Democrats come into charge in the House of Representatives? The probes that are going on now are the Russia probe, of course. Is Mr. Trump actually the czar? And number two, what about Hillary and her emails? Both of those things are under investigation by the government. Hillary's much less, of course. If the Democrats come in, what's going to happen to those investigations? Will we see yet more emphasis on the Russia probe? And will the Hillary problem be swept under the rug, or vice versa? If the Republicans maintain control or even increase control, what's going to happen to the Russia probe, the Mueller probe, and any potential increase of the Hillary probe and her emails? That's going to be really interesting. All right, we've now taken care of part one. We've said who's running. People are running for the House, for the Senate, but basically somehow Mr. Trump is also running. This is pretty much under his umbrella. In this election, there's a real strong emphasis. No matter who you vote for, Congress or Senate, you're also voting for or against Trump. Now, that's generally true in midterms, but I have the feeling that this time it's more true than ever, or at least than in recent memory. So let's go a little bit superficially and a little bit farther into this. This is part two, in other words. The Republicans and Mr. Trump, let's talk about the successes that they've enjoyed just to get an idea of the environment that these elections are taking place in. Mr. Trump has had some surprising successes with Korea, for instance, and we all know about that. He and the leader of North Korea are getting along very well. We'll see where that goes. That is still a question, of course. And the economy, he has great numbers, Mr. Trump, at least on the macro level. If you look at any individual, we don't know how well they're doing. It's hard to say. It's very tough to say that just because a large economy seems to be doing well, it's very hard to say that if you pick any old individual, you can prove that they're doing well. But on that macro level, Mr. Trump has the numbers with him. Low unemployment, high employment, and so forth and so on. And his trade issue is so far not working entirely against him. Again, Democrats were very upset with his new tariff arrangements, but Americans are very, very innovative, and to some extent at least, they've absorbed some of the negativity of the upcoming tariffs with China, for instance, and they're coming up with ideas on how to deal with it. So in other words, high tariffs may not mean that Mr. Trump has stepped in some sort of mud puddle, getting both feet wet. That's probably not happening. Again, Americans are very innovative and they will work their way around some of these problems. So Mr. Trump, again, is escaping a lot of the criticism that you might have thought would be leveled his way, leveled at him. And then he had a giant success recently, of course, with the Brett Kavanaugh situation. To some extent, the Republicans were able to use the events of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings against the Republicans very effectively. You've heard undoubtedly that the people rushing into the federal buildings in Washington were labeled a mob, which in my opinion they came close to being, and that will probably redound also to Mr. Trump's credit. What are some of the weaknesses? Again, this is part two of the analysis here. We're just looking at the general environment of the elections. The weaknesses of the Trumpian approach in these elections, the weakness of Mr. Trump himself is largely his character. Is he really a bullying monster? Is he a liar of some sort? And basically, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Big questions. The part of Mr. Trump that seems to come out a lot in a lot of sophisticated people's opinion has been labeled by Jungian psychologists the shadow. There was even a radio program once called The Shadow. That's a pretty popular way of looking at a person and saying, this is the bad part of a person, their shadow. Whenever you do something that you regret later on, you might say, that isn't me. And the Jungian psychologists would say, that's your shadow, the bad parts of yourself coming out. Well, it seems like Mr. Trump has the shadow emerging an awful lot. And Democrats are very happy every time that happens because they can point at Trump and say, this is exactly the kind of person that the average American mother does not want her child to become. So vote against him. Pretty powerful. Well, moving rapidly along. Let's go to part three. We've done part one, part two. We've seen who's running, which is basically House and Senate people, plus the umbrella guy, Mr. Trump. And number two, we've taken a tiny look at the environment. So what's going to happen? What are the issues? And let's look especially at Mr. Trump's strengths as he goes into this election. I keep saying he's going in. He's not up for election, but he's casting a shadow over the whole thing. He does have a lot of strengths, and you can see that. The first one, you can see very easily if you watch him at one of his rallies. This guy really is a born politician and a born speaker. They say that the previous president was a great speaker. Well, Mr. Trump, on a different level, is his equal, at least. He gives you the feeling that he has rubbed shoulders with the people that he is talking to, and he has an intimate connection with them. That's a tremendous strength. Mr. Obama had more of a mental connection with people. This guy has an intimate connection with his audience. And he can also use humor. He's actually naturally kind of funny. Previous presidents, quite often, actually, are not very funny. You can tell that they're reading a script, a joke, written for them. That was one of Hillary's great weaknesses. Total lack of a sense of humor and inability to tell a joke, even if it was written by a professional. And Mr. Trump doesn't have those weaknesses, so we're getting into his strengths now a little bit. Also, I would bring this up. What is the actual opinion of people? What do people really think of the shadow that Trump displays so often, that alleged liar, the alleged bumpkin, the alleged bully, and so forth? Well, actually, it's my contention that a lot of people in America, as in other countries, admire that set of characteristics that comes out in a person that we can label as the shadow. They might tell their son or their daughter, look, no, I don't want you doing any of that when you grow up. And then the kids go to bed and the adults get together and say, you know, that's really something there, the way he can, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And adults have a kind of a feeling that indeed Mr. Trump is displaying things that are not on the official list of good stuff, but they don't mind it, especially in their leader. As I've said before, people really admire a leader who seems to transcend politics, who seems to get up and over politics. And that is one thing that Trump, in a way, does. He actually behaves much more like a king waving from the balcony than he does act as a president. He probably has very little idea, or somewhat, let's just say he doesn't have a lot of expertise on the issues. He doesn't have any idea, compared to, let's say, Hillary, about what's going on in terms of the ins and outs of policies. But he does have this way of getting on top of a situation and acting in a relatively, one hates to say it, royal manner. Maybe he's not your image of the best possible king or the nicest possible king, but he has a combination of being a king and at the same time something of a general. And if you know anything about George Patton, the great general from World War II, he was anything but a nice guy in his image. You had to be very grateful that he wasn't born in Germany. Good thing he was born in California and he was on our side, one of the key figures in defeating Germany during the war. People admire guys like that, Patton, who was known for lots and lots and lots of yelling and lots and lots and lots of swearing and being not the most sophisticated guy in the room. People admire that in a leader, in a fighter. And to some extent, I think that Trump is taking advantage of that. So in other words, when the Democrats get together and act sophisticated and criticize Trump for breaking the rules and so forth and so on, well, those Democrats and those Democratic commentators especially are barking up the wrong tree. They really ought to be talking to the people and finding out what they think about these characteristics, those shadow characteristics in Mr. Trump. All right, so far we've said, in other words, Mr. Trump may not be in that bad a position, and the shadow that he's casting over Republican candidates might be doing them some good. Let's see if there are any more. One reason why I think that the Republicans might do better than predicted is that the analyses done by the media of the candidates, and especially of Mr. Trump and the situation in general, the political situation in general, the analyses are often extremely superficial and extremely non-analytical. And one reason for that is we have a different set of people doing these analyses on the media than we used to. Decades ago, and not very many decades ago, there were people like Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley and so forth, who were people who were experienced in life and who also had a relatively analytical approach towards the news instead of a biased approach towards the news, and seemed to have a better grip, not only on the facts, but on what the facts happen to mean. Now the media concentrate on things that are much more superficial, and every 2 minutes they stop so they can sell drugs. The next thing that might be something that Mr. Trump will be able to take advantage of is that, in general, the public in America is fairly badly informed, partly because of the media that I just talked about, but also for other reasons. In other countries, there is, at least I think so, a generally higher level of knowledge among the people about politics. There's a recent poll that just came out that was published in a real magazine that said 60% of the people questioned in a recent poll, 60% of Americans could not name our enemies, the people we fought during World War II. What do they think? That it was Mexico or what? Absolutely astounding. 6 out of 10 didn't even know that. So when the media point to Putin and other leaders of Russia, for instance, 60% of the American people don't even know Russia was our great, grand, reliable ally during World War II. And that puts the current facts, the facts of today, into a certain environment that people ought to know. and they don't. Well, that's just one example. How about this, the big immigration debate? The immigration debate, you would think, well, I don't know. If you think about it, actually, you could say it could go in favor of either party. It could be good for either party. And people are saying on the Democratic side, look, almost all Americans are immigrants, therefore, we ought to have some degree of sympathy for immigrants, including people who are undocumented, lacking papers, in other words, who are illegal. And the problem with that is that the people who are very, very sympathetic to illegal immigration, and you can be, by the way, very sympathetic towards illegal immigrants. That's wonderful, at the same time that you're against illegal immigration. That's a very important point, and hardly anybody makes it. The immigration argument centers basically on the law. Do we want to enforce the law or not? People come in, break the law by being here, break the law in various ways by staying here. Do we want to enforce the law? And the question is, number one, do we want to enforce the law? And the second question is, where does law come from? Why bother with it? What's so important about it? Well, the law comes from really, really basic rules that largely come out of religion. Laws are based on morals and ethics. Every law is based on morals. Even parking laws put 25 cents in the meter for 12. Well, if you're in San Francisco, that'll get you 12 seconds. In other places, it'll get you 12 minutes, let's say. And is that really a moral consideration? Is the law that says you have to pay for a parking space a moral consideration? Of course it is. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You don't want other people parking all day, all night in their favorite spot for free, hogging that spot and letting nobody else have the opportunity. So laws are always related to ethics, morals, and ultimately to religion. So a person who says it's okay for immigrants to break the law by coming in here and continue to break the laws is treading on somewhat dangerous territory. And this is an issue that America still has to deal with. Now, what's it got to do with the election? I don't know. I don't know what the ultimate effect is going to be, because you could say, this is answer number one, you could say that people in favor of enforcing the laws are going to outnumber the people who say, I'm sympathetic to people who come in even illegally, or you could say vice versa. We really don't know. What I'm trying to point out is it's not just an issue of feeling sorry for and respectful towards people who come into the country without any legal basis. It has to do with the essence of what holds society together, which in many cases is law, morals, ethics, even religion. One of the last things to say about all of this is that Mr. Trump, I want to review, by the way, we're on part 3 still, and we're saying what are Trump's possible successes or possible strengths in the election. Well, one thing is low voter turnout. It's a really strange thing, but the people who could benefit from a Democratic takeover, namely poorer people, well, they vote less than other people. They've learned in life, if you vote, nothing changes anyway. Or let's say they don't have a car, they can't get to a voting place. And also Republicans in various governments in America and various state governments have now made it harder for people to vote at all. And that hits people especially who are poor, who live in rural places that are far from polls, and they're being told now that they have to have special identification in order to vote. That controversy is well known. We'll see how that plays out. The last thing to say at all is that the great advantage that Trump and the Republicans have in this election is the Democrats themselves, especially Democratic leaders. It's an absolute shame that is the panoply of leaders that the Democratic Party has at the moment, in my opinion. They are basically conservative. They are basically conservative. They were shown up by Bernie Sanders in the last election. Bernie did surprisingly well. He revealed that there are a lot of people out there who are not afraid to vote socialist, relatively left-wing, in other words, not communist. So Bernie Sanders showed the party really where it ought to be going, in a progressive direction. Naturally, the leadership opposed him and beat him by unethical means, giving special voters or special voting rights to Hillary, for instance, at the convention. So the last thing to say, the ultimate last thing to say about this is that the political leadership among the Democratic Party is far too right-wing to satisfy Trump's voters. Yes, that's right. They're far too right-wing and conservative to satisfy Trump's voters, and Trump knows that. He has very, very creatively appealed to the very people who ought to be voting in the direction of Bernie Sanders and other progressives in the Democratic Party. So isn't that a surprise? Well, next time we'll probably be analyzing what happened in the election, so stay tuned.